North Carolina is certainly a hotbed of grassroots activism, but it's also got red hot electoral politics in the mix. You may remember someone named Senator Erica Smith. She was a state senator. She was a progressive who jumped into the 2020 race for the United States Senate to challenge Republican Thom Tillis. But note the word progressive. That didn't sit well with Chuck Schumer, who year after year bungles winnable Senate races by manipulating party primary elections so his preferred candidates get chosen to run as the Democratic nominee. Now, preferred candidates means corporatist duds who lose election after election. And Schumer bungled again in 2020 in the North Carolina race. He handpicked the most uninspired, dumb as a brick candidate, Cal Cunningham, who, with piles of Schumer-directed money, won the primary and then proceeded to crash and burn, handing Thom Tillis his reelection. You could actually say that that bungling of that race alone cratered the $15 an hour minimum wage hike and other progressive policy efforts because it meant that the Senate ended up in a 50-50 tie, which gave inordinate power to fifth columnist and corporatist Joe Manchin. And one other note, handpicking corporate-friendly candidates over progressives is just bad, stupid electoral politics. And I can show you how with real evidence. While Joe Biden was losing Florida in the general election, the ballot initiative to raise the state minimum wage to $15 an hour was passing easily with over 60% support. Right after the election, I looked at the voting results in every county, and you can see that in my newsletter. I published that in my newsletter on Substack, and I looked in the voting results in every county in Florida, and in virtually every county, the vote to raise the minimum wage outperformed Joe Biden. What people were saying was pretty clear. Give me a policy that puts money in my pocket and isn't about supporting rich people over regular people, and I'll vote for it, whether you call it progressive or you call it a loaf of bread. So Erica is back now. She's running for the Senate again for the seat that is opening up in 2022 with the retirement of Republican Richard Burr. And it's great to have Erica on the show. So, Erica, here you are on the campaign trail now for the second time in a U.S. Senate race. And we'll talk briefly a little bit about 2020, maybe as we get into the conversation. But I wanted to start with something you wrote, which I thought was so powerful. And it was posted as part of a declaration, a piece that you wrote for our friends at Blue America. And here's what you wrote. This is not a campaign about me. It is a moral movement about answering the hate and division and economic inequality that is tearing this country apart with radical love. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that is an understanding that we've been through so much in the last year in this nation. And in this past 4 years of administration, where we had divisive politics tear us apart, divide us in our communities, and pull us away from the foundational principles of this nation. We've been a country that's a refuge, a country where we can have equality for all, where we're all endowed by our Creator. And so it is going to take radical love. It's going to take a progressive agenda that promotes a survivor's agenda to reach those who have not been well served, who have not been represented, who have been victims of systemic racism and oppression, economic oppression, wealth inequality in this nation. It is past time that we once and for all fight for the people who need us to fight for them the most and make this America one that works for all of us and not just the wealthy and the well-connected.
I wonder if you see the connection that Dr. King saw between economic inequality and racial justice and how those two interrelate, especially as we're coming out of this debate around raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and especially because we just celebrated International Women's Day. And those things are connected because, as you well know, workers of color and especially women are disproportionately affected by the question of raising the minimum wage because they disproportionately are represented in minimum wage jobs.
Absolutely. And as a theologian myself, I have studied Dr. Martin Luther King, and I was very excited about Andrew Yang bringing up UBI, but that universal basic income, a guaranteed basic income, that was from the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King aspired to build. It is in the issue between economic equality and racial equality. They go hand in hand. As Dr. King would say, they are inextricably bound. And so what we understand with persistent discrimination comes the persistent economic devastation for Black and Brown communities. And so I have been a firm advocate. I've fought all my life through ministry, through community building, through social justice to advocate for racial justice that's inherent in economic justice.
Huh. Interesting. You mentioned a moment ago that you're running on a progressive platform. And in fact, I looked at your website. I studied it very carefully, and you are quite progressive on your policy issues. You support Medicare for all, example. I wonder if you want to give a think and a thought about what the term progressive means and whether it really fits in this political debate that we're having now. And here's what I mean. And you may want to relate this to North Carolina. In Florida, as you well know, Donald Trump won Florida during the election. But at the same time, the minimum wage was on the ballot there, and it passed overwhelmingly by 60%. And right after the election, I did a little analysis, and I looked at every single county, which took a long time. I looked at every single county, and every single county, the vote in favor of the minimum wage was higher than the vote for Joe Biden. Even in the counties that Biden won, the minimum wage did much better. So does that tell you something about how progressive values and progressive ideas kind of don't fit the traditional political spectrum, especially if you want to relate it to North Carolina?
Well, I said this very early on in my campaign. People asked me about my platform, how would I describe it? And I would describe it as a survivor's agenda. We past time is it that we should continue to have people in Congress representing us who have never had to struggle for anything, Jonathan. I didn't come from wealth, I came from hard work. And I know the value of a dollar and how many times we have to turn that dollar over in the community, which makes it a challenge as a Black woman, particularly in the South, when Black women don't earn but 62 cents on the dollar of a white male. For Latina women, that's 57. For First American women, Indigenous women, that's about 52. And so unfortunately, because we are taxed at 100% rate of a male, but yet not paid on the rate of a male, that income inequality is certainly something that's a challenge for women in the workforce. Women in the workforce are heavily dominated in as service employees who work off of tips. So when we talk about a $7.25 minimum wage, what does that really mean for someone who works from tips at $2.39? This is an issue, and it's no wonder that the discussion and that referendum on the ballot of raising the minimum wage does so much better. I've said from the very beginning, mine is a survivor's agenda. It is an agenda for working Americans. It's for those of us who have to roll up our sleeves and make the entire rest of the nation work. And we deserve the dignity of our work, and that's a livable wage at $15 an hour minimum.
Yes, and that's your point. You mentioned that. That's a floor, and I think people forget. Yeah, actually, the minimum wage, if you looked at productivity and how hard people worked over 40 years, should be way above $20 an hour. It should probably be around $22 an hour. 24, exactly. Because $15 an hour, if you do the math, only comes out to about $32,000 a year if you work full time, 52 weeks a year, no vacation, 40 hours a week. And that's not much of a wage annually to try to survive on, right?
Jonathan, it's infuriating when people who make these decisions about the livable wage and they take votes and they talk about $15 being too much. It's not enough. And so, are you comfortable with $11 when you make $175,000 a year, but yet you sit in Washington, D.C. in the chamber and you take votes about not even raising the wage to a survivor's wage?
I wonder who you were referring to when you were mentioning $11 an hour and and the wealthy people. But I will say directly, there's no question in my mind that had you been the nominee in 2020, and then therefore you probably would have defeated the incumbent Thom Tillis and sat in the Senate, then we wouldn't have one particular senator essentially blocking a raise for millions of people, because you would have sat there and you would have
Absolutely.
argued along with Bernie Sanders and other progressive senators that this is just a floor, as you point out. So does
It's
that,
just a
do you
floor.
ever think,
It will
do you
it
ever,
will take 39 million people out of poverty just by raising the wage.
Mhm. Do you ever then think about this in the context of party politics and how all that kind of shook out, and the way in which, and it goes back to my previous question, the way in which progressive values and the progressive movement and progressive policy ideas are actually winning ideas, but some of those folks in Washington and the people who try to tap other candidates and give them money don't really realize that and don't understand what people are going through.
Absolutely. Not only do they not understand, but they've abdicated their responsibility to serve to special interests and corporations. That's why I don't take a dime of corporate PAC money or fossil fuel money. I work for the people who hire me, and that's the voters of North Carolina. And when we struggle and work so hard day in and day out, we have to fight to send people to represent us who walk a mile in our shoes, who know what it is to have to get up every morning and punch a clock, who respect being able to take care of their families and provide for their families. And so I am honored to offer myself, and I hope to earn the privilege to represent so many people across this state and nation who just want America to work better for all of us.
And so you are a very strong supporter of unions, as I know. And I want to connect that to a conversation I had previously on this program with Precious Cole, who is very active in the North Carolina Fight for 15 movement. But that movement says fight for 15 and a union. And so talk a little bit about your vision for unionization in North Carolina, which is quite low relative to the rest of the nation. I believe it's about 2% in the private sector.
Right. And barriers are created every day to kill unions. But if we're going to rebuild the middle class, we have to start supporting unions and revitalizing unions across the nation. And it's tough to do in a right to work state like North Carolina, but this is the battleground for it. I have always understood the strength of unions. My dad was in the mail handlers union. And in fact, my twin sister and I are scholarship recipients. We were able to better afford a college education through the donation and the philanthropy of unions. So no wonder when I became an engineer in Seattle, Washington, I joined the union and I was a steward and a representative of SPEA, which is the Electrical and Engineers Association. And so I fundamentally understand working for workers' rights, advocating for equity, advocating for fairness. That is very important to workers, and that's always been important to me wherever I've worked. When I worked for the United States Patent and Trademark Office, I was an officer in Blacks in Government, and we advocate for employees, employee rights, the patent examiners union. POPA, I was also a representative there. And then I had the opportunity to serve as a treasurer for the Greensville Education Association as a public school educator and member of Virginia Education Association. If we're going to have the opportunities to get equal pay for equal work, an adequate wage, we have to strengthen the unions, because in strengthening the unions, we're also building stronger families and better able to provide for our communities.
And to your point, it's very hard to organize unions actually anywhere. It's certainly harder in a right to work state, but employers spend millions of dollars to defeat unions. And one of the things that obviously you might have a chance to vote on is the so-called PRO Act, which would strengthen union rights and make it a lot harder, somewhat harder, for corporations to basically union bust, right?
Right, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I was the freshman legislator of the year by the largest union and employee organization in our state, and that's the State Employees Association, Impact. And as a Black woman in a Republican supermajority, how do you earn that? Because you roll up your sleeves and you fight for the people who make this whole state work for us. And so not only are we under attack by proposed legislation, and so I'm so happy for the PRO Act, but also in North Carolina, we had a majority rule leadership who was trying to take away the right to have membership dues deducted. And so we have to confront and combat the obstacles for pro-union organization, and that's part of what's going on in North Carolina.
So, in the last couple of minutes that we're going to talk here, on that point, when you're out there campaigning, talking to people, maybe in the streets, I know it's hard probably because of social distancing, campaigning is a little bit different, but
Yeah.
you're probably interacting still with voters. Are you hearing from them that they would definitely, in a so-called purple state, one of those states which is, as people say, is still being fought over between Republicans and Democrats, would they really embrace someone like you, a progressive person with that kind of vision in a general election?
Oh, absolutely. Because what they're tired of is sending people to Washington, D.C. who are out of touch, who have never had to work hard or struggle for anything, who can sit with good health care because our tax dollars pay your salary and pay for your health care, but yet you make a decision about us having access to health care. I'm the only candidate who has lived in, grew up in, worked in, and organized in the rural part of the state. My district in the state Senate is 100% rural. It was located in northeastern North Carolina, and all across that region, Black, white, brown people come together on the issues that matter to us, the issues that keep us up at night, the issues of not having broadband access and having our students have to suffer through lack of educational opportunities because they can't stay connected to virtual learning. And so what we have heard and what people tell us every day, and when they reach out to us when we have our virtual town halls or when we're doing our meet and greets, socially distanced, of course, everyone wants someone who will understand what it takes to navigate these policies that they're making decisions about, but don't have a clue of the disparate impacts on the ground. They want one of us for all of us. And that is why that is the motto of our movement that we are building. We're going everywhere, we're talking to everybody, and we are firing people up because they know in me, they get someone who's a hard worker, who grew up on a farm, who understands the importance of getting capital and access to small businesses and bringing communities together and having the infrastructure. So that's what's exciting, Jonathan. That's what we're hearing on the ground. And whether, no matter what you want to call this agenda, it is the agenda that will work for all of us.
And so my last question is, obviously, it's a little different campaigning now than in 2020, I guess, when you were campaigning for the Senate. There seems to be a different mood in the country. What's been the hardest thing and the easiest thing that you've confronted? Maybe contrast the two things compared to other campaigns, something you found different or something that you found is really something similar that you've encountered throughout all your political life.
It's harder to connect face to face because of the COVID restrictions and the limitations on the amount of people that you could have at events. But we have looked at the obstacles and the barriers and we have taken them one step at a time. And we had an amazing campaign kickoff, socially distanced outside at a historic high school in Durham. And just to have the energy of the car rallies and everybody masked up and protected, but understanding that we've been through so much in this nation nation between Black Lives Matters protests, the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, this pandemic that's shown us just how broken our healthcare system is, and this economic downturn that's shown how economically unjust our systems are. What we have learned is that people are the same. Whether we're meeting them virtually, that's what's been easy. Whether we're meeting them virtually or meeting them face to face, or whether we're calling them on the phone and doing a small coffee chat, everyone's heart is for an America that is finally going to turn the curve on the division of the last 4 years. The disappointment for North Carolina in some of our election outcomes in November, and the determination to not allow that to happen again. And so they've been more, what's been easy is people have been opening up about electability, about changing the criteria of who we believe is an electable candidate. They want someone of honor, character, and integrity who's going to put the people first. And so that's what's been easy for us. We've always been that person, and it's been great to connect with people, whether virtually or whether face-to-face. And we'll continue to do that.
Well, Erica, thanks very much for taking a few minutes to talk about your campaign. You're sort of just in the beginning, and we really would love to have you back on the show to update us and tell us how you're doing on the campaign trail as the campaign continues and as you become hopefully the nominee. And stay safe out there.
I will. You do the same, and we'll be happy to come back. Thank you so much for having me. And I would love for your listeners to try to get to know me. They can go to my website. They can follow us on Twitter. It's Erica for Us. Thank you.